In the spring of 2016, Shanika Wilson moved from a small town in Florida to the spacious home of her new partner, Leroy Thomas, nestled near the swampy banks of the St. Johns River in Seminole County. She had packed her belongings into a few weathered suitcases, leaving behind a cramped apartment where she had lived alone for years. Leroy's house, a single-story structure with a wraparound porch and peeling white paint, sat on a quiet plot surrounded by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The air carried the earthy scent of the nearby river, a constant reminder of the wildness that defined this part of Florida. Shanika, an experienced alligator trainer, worked at a local wildlife preserve a few miles down the road, where she spent her days handling and caring for the ancient reptiles that fascinated her since childhood. Her job required skill and fearlessness, qualities she had honed over years of working with creatures most people avoided. The move to Leroy's place had felt like a fresh start. She had met him only months before, but their connection had deepened quickly, and the promise of a shared life excited her. She imagined turning the house into a real home, adding curtains to the bare windows, planting flowers along the porch, maybe even building a small dock by the riverbank where they could sit together in the evenings. Leroy, with his warm smile and steady hands, seemed like the kind of man she could build something lasting with. On the morning of May 14th, Shanika woke early, as she always did. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden light through the bedroom window. She slipped into her work clothes, a faded green polo shirt with the preserve's logo and sturdy khaki pants, before heading to the kitchen. The smell of coffee lingered in the air as she prepared a quick breakfast, her routine unchanged despite the new surroundings. She packed her worn canvas bag with the tools of her trade, a pair of thick gloves, a hooked pole for guiding the alligators, and a small bucket of raw chicken scraps she used as feed during training sessions. The bag, patched in places from years of use, was a familiar weight on her shoulder as she stepped onto the porch. Leroy followed her outside, his boots scuffing against the wooden planks. He leaned against the railing, watching as she loaded the bag into her beat-up pickup truck parked in the gravel driveway. The engine sputtered to life, and with a wave, she pulled away, heading down the winding road toward the preserve. The drive took her past fields of tall grass and patches of murky water, the river glinting in the distance under the morning sun. She arrived at the preserve just after 7, parking near the main gate where a faded sign welcomed visitors to Gator Haven. That day, like most others, she began her work with a routine check of the enclosures. The preserve housed a dozen alligators, but her focus was on Big Joe, a massive 13-foot male with a scarred snout and a reputation for unpredictability. She entered his pen, her movements calm and practiced, ready to run through the training exercises that kept him responsive to her commands. The air was thick with humidity, and the buzz of insects filled the silence as she worked. But then, something went wrong. Shanika vanished. Her colleagues, who had been busy preparing for the day's first tour group, noticed her absence when the usual sounds of her session with Big Joe, splashes, sharp whistles, the thud of her pole, fell silent. They rushed to the enclosure, their boots sinking into the muddy ground near the water's edge. What they found chilled them. A torn strap from her bag floated in the shallows, and scuff marks marred the bank, hinting at a struggle. Big Joe lurked nearby, his dark eyes unreadable. Word spread quickly. By midday, whispers circulated through the preserve and beyond. Shanika must have been dragged under by the alligator, a tragic accident for someone so skilled. Her colleagues searched the water, their shouts echoing across the river, but found no trace of her. Leroy received the call as he worked under the hood of a car at his garage, the news hitting him like a physical blow. He raced to the preserve, arriving to a scene of chaos, staff milling about, visitors being turned away, and police lights flashing in the distance. The authorities arrived soon after, cordoning off the area with yellow tape. They examined the scuff marks, the shredded bag, and the restless alligator, piecing together a story that seemed all too plausible in a place where nature often had the final say. Yet, as Leroy stood there, staring at the water where Shanika had last been seen, a quiet unease settled over him, mingling with his grief. The official explanation felt too neat, too sudden, and the questions it left unanswered gnawed at him as the day faded into dusk. Several months before the tragedy unfolded, Shanika Wilson and Leroy Thomas crossed paths at a bustling county fair in Orlando. It was late October 2015, and the air buzzed with the sounds of carnival rides, the chatter of crowds, and the sizzle of fried food from vendors' stalls. Shanika had gone with a few friends, her laughter ringing out as she tossed rings at bottles in a game booth. Leroy, there to help a buddy fix a malfunctioning Ferris wheel, caught sight of her from across the midway. His easy grin and the way he carried himself, confident yet unassuming, drew her in. They struck up a conversation near a cotton candy stand, the sticky sweetness clinging to the air as they talked about nothing and everything. By the end of the night, he had her number scribbled on a napkin, and she had a promise of a call. What began as a chance encounter blossomed into something more over the following weeks. Dates at quiet diners turned into long evenings on his porch, and soon Shanika found herself spending more time at his place than her own. Their romance moved fast, fueled by a mutual sense of possibility. Leroy, a mechanic who spent his days elbow-deep in engines at a small garage in Sanford, charmed her with his steady presence. He had a knack for fixing things, cars, leaky faucets, even the creaky steps on his porch, and Shanika admired how he approached life with a quiet determination. She saw in him a partner, someone who listened when she talked about her work with the alligators, who didn't flinch at the scars on her hands from years of handling the beasts. By early 2016, she made the decision to leave her old life behind, a rented room in a sleepy town an hour away, a place filled with little more than a bed and a handful of memories. She packed her things and moved into Leroy's house, drawn by the vision of a future they could build together. She didn't question the speed of it all, it felt right, like the pieces of her life were finally falling into place. Leroy, for his part, played the role of the perfect companion. He cooked her dinners after her long shifts at the preserve, greeted her with a cold drink when she came home muddy and tired, and talked about turning the spare room into a space for her gear. But beneath his warm exterior lay a secret he hadn't shared. 7 years earlier, he had married Kimberly Thomas, a woman he'd met through mutual friends. Their marriage had been a rocky one, marked by arguments over money and his long hours at the garage. They'd separated 2 years prior, or so Leroy believed, but the divorce papers sat unsigned in a drawer at his old apartment, a detail he'd neglected to mention to Shanika. Kimberly, living in a modest duplex on the edge of Orlando, hadn't let go. When she heard through the grapevine that Leroy had a new woman living with him, her anger ignited. She began calling him late at night, her voice sharp with accusations. She showed up at the garage once, banging on the locked door after hours, demanding he face her. Leroy brushed it off as lingering bitterness. He told Kimberly their marriage was over, that he'd moved on, but she refused to accept it. Her texts grew more frequent, pleading one day, threatening the next. She warned him he'd regret leaving her, that she'd make sure his new life crumbled. Leroy deleted the messages, hoping distance would wear her down. Shanika noticed his occasional distraction, the way he'd glance at his phone and shove it back into his pocket, but she chalked it up to work stress. He never spoke of Kimberly, and she never pressed him, trusting the man she'd fallen for. Meanwhile, Kimberly's resentment festered. She sat alone in her dimly lit living room, replaying every moment of their failed marriage, convincing herself Shanika had stolen what was hers. Her hurt twisted into something darker, a cold resolve taking root. She began to imagine a way to reclaim her hold on Leroy, and in her mind, that meant Shanika had to go. The seed of a plan took shape, one she kept locked away, nursing it like a wound that wouldn't heal. Kimberly's resolve hardened as the weeks passed, her nights spent pacing the worn carpet of her duplex, plotting a way to erase Shanika from Leroy's life. She knew she couldn't do it alone, her hands trembled too much, her mind raced with doubts, but she also knew there were people who could be bought, men who thrived in the shadows of places like Orlando's rougher edges. In early April 2016, she found herself driving down a dusty road on the city's outskirts, past rusted trailers and overgrown lots, until she reached a squat bar with neon signs flickering in the daylight. Inside, the air smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke, and the jukebox hummed a low tune. She had heard whispers about Darrell Cox through a former co-worker, a man who'd once bragged about hiring him to deal with a troublesome ex. Darrell was a former hunter, lean and weathered from years spent stalking game in the swamps, though now he made his living through less legal means, running errands for those who paid cash and asked no questions. She spotted him at the end of the bar, nursing a whiskey, his faded denim jacket slung over the stool beside him. His eyes, sharp and calculating, met hers as she approached, and she wasted no time laying out her proposition. She offered him a wad of bills, $5,000, scraped together from savings and a loan she'd taken against her car, promising more once the job was done. Darrell listened, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his face betraying no surprise at the request. He had done worse for less, and the sum caught his interest. Kimberly explained Shanika's job at the wildlife preserve, her voice steady as she described the alligators Shanika worked with every day. She suggested a plan: stage an attack, let one of the creatures take the blame. It would look like an accident, she reasoned. No one would question a trainer's death in the jaws of a beast she handled for a living. Darrell nodded slowly, already turning the idea over in his mind, seeing the simplicity of it. He began his work the next day, driving his battered Chevy truck to Seminole County under the guise of a fisherman scouting the river. He parked near the preserve, a sprawling patch of marshland dotted with wooden walkways and chain-link enclosures, and watched from a distance. Shanika arrived each morning around 7, her pickup rumbling into the lot, her figure moving with purpose as she hauled her gear toward the pens. Darrell noted her routine, how she checked the smaller alligators first, then spent the bulk of her time with a massive one he overheard a tour guide call Big Joe. He kept his distance, blending in with the occasional visitors or locals who lingered near the water, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Over the next week, he mapped her movements, the way she lingered by the riverbank to prep her tools, the moments she stood alone in the enclosure, the predictable rhythm of her mornings. He liked the predictability, it made his job easier. One moonless night in late April, he returned to the preserve after hours. The gate creaked as he slipped through, a pair of bolt cutters tucked under his arm. The air was thick with the croaks of frogs and the distant splash of fish, masking the sound of his footsteps on the damp earth. He moved toward Big Joe's enclosure, a sturdy pen reinforced with metal posts, its occupant a hulking shadow in the water. Darrell crouched low, studying the setup. The alligator's size impressed him, 13 feet of muscle and teeth, restless even in sleep. He tested the lock on the gate, finding it solid but not unbreakable, and ran his fingers along the hinges, noting where a little force could loosen them. This was his weapon, he decided, a force of nature he could bend to his will. Satisfied, he retreated into the darkness, leaving no trace of his visit beyond a few bent blades of grass. Kimberly met him again a few days later, this time in a deserted parking lot near a shuttered gas station. She handed him a plastic bag containing a tattered jacket, Shanika's, she said, left behind by Leroy in their old home before he moved out. It still carried her scent, a mix of sweat and the faint musk of the swamp, perfect for luring Big Joe into action. Darrell took it without a word, stuffing it into his truck's glove box. She pressed a roll of 20s into his palm, another 1,000, a down payment to seal their pact. Her eyes burned with a mix of desperation and certainty, and he saw she wouldn't back out. They settled on mid-May for the execution, a time when the preserve's tourist season slowed, leaving fewer eyes to witness what would happen. Darrell spent the intervening days preparing, sharpening a crowbar to pry the enclosure's lock, testing the weight of a rock he'd use to stun Shanika if needed. He drove past the preserve once more, memorizing the layout, the escape route along a back road that wound through the pines. The plan solidified in his mind, each step cold and mechanical, a hunter's instinct guiding him toward the kill. Kimberly waited at home, counting the days, her anger now a quiet, simmering thing, ready to erupt when the moment arrived. On May 14, 2016, Shanika Wilson pulled into the gravel lot of the wildlife preserve just before 8 in the morning, her pickup truck kicking up a faint cloud of dust as it rolled to a stop. The sun had climbed above the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, though the air still carried the cool dampness of dawn. She stepped out, her boots crunching against the ground, and slung her canvas bag over her shoulder. The preserve was quiet at this hour, the usual hum of tourists and school groups yet to arrive. She walked past the weathered sign at the entrance, its paint chipped from years of sun and rain, and headed toward the row of enclosures that lined the riverbank. Her morning routine was second nature by now. Check the smaller alligators first, ensure their water was clean, then move on to the main event, her session with Big Joe. She carried a bucket of chicken scraps in one hand, the metal handle digging into her palm, and her hooked pole in the other, its tip worn from countless hours of guiding the beasts. She started with the juvenile gators, peering into their pens to confirm they were active, tossing in bits of meat to keep them occupied. The smaller ones snapped at the food with quick, jerky movements, their jaws clicking shut in the still air. Satisfied, she moved toward Big Joe's enclosure, a larger pen set apart from the others, its chain-link fence reinforced with steel bars. The alligator lay half submerged in the shallow water, his eyes glinting above the surface like polished stones. Shanika set her bag down near the gate, unzipping it to pull out her gloves, and took a moment to stretch her shoulders, the familiar ache of her work settling into her muscles. She didn't notice the feint given the lock as she unlatched it, a subtle weakness Daryl had introduced the night before with a pry bar and a steady hand. She stepped inside, her boots sinking slightly into the muddy earth, and began her training, tapping the pole against the ground to rouse Big Joe from his sluggish rest. Daryl Cox watched from a thicket of palmettos 50 yards away, his body crouched low among the spiky fronds. He had arrived before dawn, parking his truck a mile down a dirt trail and hiking through the underbrush to avoid the main road. His breath was shallow, his pulse steady, years of hunting keeping his nerves in check. He wore a dark jacket, its hood pulled up to shield his face, and carried Shanika's old coat tucked under his arm, its fabric still faintly damp from the swamp air. He had scouted this spot days earlier, knowing it offered a clear view of the enclosure while keeping him hidden from the preserve's sparse staff. As Shanika worked, he edged closer, moving with the patience of a predator, his boots silent on the soft ground. He stopped 20 feet from the pen, close enough to hear the rhythmic thud of her pole, and waited for her to turn her back to the water, a moment he knew would come when she reached for more feed. When she bent to retrieve the bucket, Daryl struck. He slipped the jacket from under his arm and lobbed it into the shallows near the enclosure's edge, the splash barely audible over the rustle of the wind. Big Joe stirred, his massive tail flicking as the scent hit his nostrils, a mix of Shanika's familiar presence and the lure Daryl had planted. With a flick of his wrist, Daryl tugged at a thin wire he'd rigged to the weakened lock, pulling it free. The gate swung open, and Big Joe lunged, his jaws parting in a rush of water and mud. Shanika spun at the sound, her pole raised instinctively, but the alligator's speed caught her off guard. She swung at him, the metal clanging against his snout, but Daryl was already moving. He darted from the thicket, a heavy river rock clutched in his hand, and closed the distance in seconds. Before she could fully react, he brought the rock down on the back of her head, a dull thud echoing as she crumpled to her knees, dazed. Big Joe surged forward, his claws raking the mud, and Daryl acted fast. He shoved Shanika's limp form toward the water, her body sliding into the shallows with a soft splash. The alligator seized her, his teeth sinking into her side as he dragged her under, the surface rippling violently before settling into an eerie calm. Daryl stepped back, wiping the rock on his pants and tossing it into the brush. He grabbed her bag, tearing its strap with a quick yank to mimic a struggle, and flung it near the bank. Then he retreated, melting into the thicket as quickly as he'd come, his figure vanishing among the trees. Minutes later, a shout broke the silence. Another trainer, drawn by the commotion, sprinted toward the enclosure. He found the gate ajar, Big Joe circling in the water, and a smear of blood staining the mud. The torn bag floated nearby, its contents spilling into the current. The preserve erupted into chaos. Staff gathered at the scene, their voices rising in panic as they scanned the water, hoping for a sign of Shanika but dreading what they might find. One called the police while another tried to coax Big Joe back into the pen, his pole trembling in his hands. Sirens wailed in the distance as patrol cars arrived, officers stepping out to survey the grim tableau. They noted the claw marks, the blood, the shredded bag, evidence that pointed to a tragic mishap. By noon, they had cordoned off the area, their radios crackling with initial reports of an alligator attack. Leroy got the call at his garage, his wrench slipping from his hand as the voice on the line relayed the news. He drove to the preserve in a daze, arriving to find officers shaking their heads and staff whispering among themselves. The police concluded it was an accident, a lock failure, a moment of bad luck, convincing to all but Leroy, who stood by the water's edge, staring at the ripples, his gut twisting with a doubt he couldn't name. The investigation into Shanika Wilson's disappearance began as a routine matter, a procedural checklist for what seemed like a clear-cut tragedy. Officers from the Seminole County Sheriff's Department had lingered at the preserve that afternoon, taking photographs of the enclosure, jotting notes about the bloodstains and claw marks, and interviewing the shaken staff. They assumed Big Joe had broken free, a natural hazard of Shanika's line of work, and prepared to file a report labeling it an occupational fatality. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the river, one of the preserve's maintenance workers lingered near the pen, his brow furrowed. He ran his fingers over the lock on Big Joe's gate, noting the odd scratches and the way the metal bent outward, damage that didn't match the alligator's brute force. He pointed it out to a deputy, who shrugged but added it to his notes. Later, as the team dragged the shallows with nets, they found the tracks near the water's edge seemed off, too scattered, too deliberate, not the chaotic thrashing of a predator's attack. Detective Marcus Pierce took over the case the next morning, a wiry man with a decade on the force and a reputation for spotting what others missed. He arrived at the preserve just as the staff reopened the gates, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Pierce walked the scene alone, his boots sinking into the mud as he traced Shanika's last steps. He crouched by the enclosure, studying the lock under the harsh beam of his flashlight. The scratches weren't random, they suggested a tool, maybe a crowbar, had pried it loose. He bagged the lock as evidence and turned his attention to the bank, where the scuff marks hinted at a struggle beyond what an alligator could cause. A faint imprint, barely noticeable, caught his eye, a boot tread, too small for Shanika's work boots, pressed into the soil near the thicket. Pierce's gut told him this wasn't an accident, and he decided to dig deeper, pulling the case from the pile of soon-to-be-closed files. He started with Leroy Thomas, meeting him at the garage 2 days later. Leroy sat on a stool amid the clutter of tools and oil cans, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes red from sleepless nights. Pierce asked about Shanika's life, her habits, anyone who might have wished her harm. Leroy hesitated, then mentioned Kimberly, his estranged wife, still legally tied to him, whose calls and threats had shadowed his new start with Shanika. He recounted her bitterness, the way she'd vowed to ruin him, though he hadn't taken it seriously until now. Pierce jotted it down, his pen scratching against the notepad, and left with a new thread to pull. He drove to the bank Kimberly used, a squat brick building in Orlando, and requested her records. The teller handed over a statement showing a withdrawal of $6,000 on May 13th, the day before Shanika vanished, far more than Kimberly's modest income as a cashier could justify. The lead gnawed at Pierce, and he took it to a dive bar on the city's fringes, a place he knew from past cases where secrets spilled over cheap drinks. He nursed a soda at the counter, listening as the bartender grumbled about a woman who'd met a rough-looking guy there weeks back. A regular, nursing a beer in the corner, overheard and chimed in. He'd seen her too, a tense woman with dark hair, passing cash to a man in a denim jacket. Pierce showed him a photo of Kimberly from her driver's license, and the man nodded. The guy she met? Darrell Cox, he said, a local fixer with a rap sheet stretching back years. Pierce thanked him with a 20 and headed back to the station, pulling Darrell's file. Assault, theft, a stint in county jail, the pieces fit too well to ignore. By May 25th, Pierce had a warrant. He led a team to Darrell's ramshackle trailer on the edge of town, a sagging structure surrounded by jumped cars and overgrown weeds. They kicked in the door at dawn, catching Darrell half-dressed, a duffel bag half-packed, on the couch. He lunged for the back door, but a deputy tackled him in the dirt outside. Inside, they found a roll of 20s, $500, crisp and sequential, matching Kimberly's withdrawal, and a crumpled map of the preserve, its edges marked with pencil lines circling Big Joe's pen. Pierce pressed Darrell in the interrogation room, laying out the evidence, the lock, the boot print, the cash. Darrell held out for an hour, his jaw clenched, but crumbled when Pierce slid the map across the table. He confessed in a low rasp, detailing how Kimberly had hired him, how he'd staged the attack, how he'd watched Big Joe finish the job. He gave her up without hesitation, pointing the finger at her as the one who'd set it all in motion. Pierce moved fast. On May 28th, he knocked on Kimberly's door, flanked by 2 uniforms. She answered in a bathrobe, her hair tangled, her eyes widening as he read her rights. She stumbled back, clutching the doorframe, but didn't resist as they cuffed her. Meanwhile, deputies tracked Darrell to a gas station 50 miles north, where he'd stopped on his way out of state, his truck loaded with what little he owned. They hauled him back in handcuffs, his escape cut short. The arrests hit Leroy like a tidal wave. He sat in his kitchen that night, staring at the wall, the truth sinking in that Shanika's death wasn't fate but a calculated act. The preserve staff gathered the next day, their whispers turning to stunned silence as word spread. The community reeled, the story rippling through Seminole County. Shanika hadn't slipped or faltered, she'd been hunted, betrayed by a woman she'd never truly known. Pierce watched it unfold, his notebook full, knowing the case was only half closed until the courts took over. The trial of Kimberly Thomas and Darrell Cox opened on October 3, 2016, in the Seminole County Courthouse, a squat brick building with faded flags snapping in the autumn breeze. The courtroom filled quickly that first morning, its wooden benches creaking under the weight of Shanika's co-workers from the preserve, Leroy's friends from the garage, and a scattering of locals drawn by the grisly tale that had dominated headlines for months. The air hung heavy with anticipation, the hum of hushed voices rising as the bailiff called the room to order. Kimberly sat at the defense table, her hair pulled back tightly, her hands folded in her lap, while Darrell slouched beside his own attorney, his eyes darting toward the gallery. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena Vasquez, stood to present the state's case, her voice cutting through the stillness as she laid out the evidence piece by piece, each item a nail in the coffin of the defendants' fates. Vasquez began with Darrell's confession, reading excerpts from the transcript where he detailed the plan, how he'd tampered with the lock, used Shanika's jacket as bait, and struck her with a rock before letting Big Joe take her. She held up photos of the damaged lock, its scratches glinting under the courtroom lights, and passed the jury a plastic bag containing the map found in Darrell's trailer, its pencil marks circling the preserve like a hunter's target. Bank records followed, showing Kimberly's withdrawal of $6,000 the day before the murder, a sum that matched the cash recovered from Darrell's belongings. Vasquez called the preserve's maintenance worker to the stand, who testified about the lock's unnatural damage, his hands fidgeting as he pointed to the exhibit. Then came Leroy, his shoulders hunched as he took the oath, his voice steady but low as he recounted Kimberly's relentless calls, her threats to destroy his new life, her refusal to let go. He stared at the floor as he spoke, avoiding her gaze across the room, the weight of his loss etched into every line of his face. The defense teams scrambled to counter the onslaught. Kimberly's attorney, a wiry man in a cheap suit, argued she'd been a scorned wife acting out of desperation, not malice, that she'd paid Darrell to scare Shanika, not kill her, and hadn't foreseen the outcome. He leaned heavily on her lack of a criminal record, painting her as a woman unmoored by heartbreak. Darrell's lawyer took a different tack, claiming his client had acted alone, exaggerating Kimberly's role to lighten his own burden. He questioned the reliability of the bar witness, suggesting the cash could have come from anywhere. But the jury remained unmoved, their faces hardening as Vasquez dismantled each argument with forensic reports and timelines, her closing statement a searing indictment of jealousy turned lethal. On October 19th, after 2 days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict, guilty on all counts, murder in the first degree for both. The judge, a stern figure in black robes, sentenced them to life without parole, his gavel striking the bench like a thunderclap. Kimberly sat motionless as the words sank in, her eyes glassy, while Darrell slumped further, his hands cuffed behind him as deputies led them away. The gallery exhaled collectively, some wiping tears, others nodding in grim satisfaction. Leroy left the courthouse alone, the autumn sun low and weak, casting his shadow long across the pavement. He drove home in silence, the trial's end offering no relief from the emptiness Shanika's death had carved into his life. But in the weeks that followed, a resolve took root. He sold a spare engine from the garage and used the money to start a fund in Shanika's name, a small nonprofit to support preserve workers with safety gear and training, things she'd always said the job needed more of. He filed the paperwork himself, his hands shaking as he wrote her name on the forms, and by spring 2017, the Shanika Wilson Safety Fund had raised enough to outfit the preserve staff with new equipment. Every May, Leroy began hosting a Memorial Day by the St. Johns River, a quiet gathering where friends, co-workers, and strangers stood on the bank, tossing flowers into the water where she'd last been. The first year, a dozen people came. By the next, it was 50, their footsteps pressing into the mud as they shared stories of Shanika's courage, her laugh, her way with the Gators. The community rallied around it, local businesses donating to the fund, volunteers planting a row of cypress trees along the preserve's edge as a living tribute. Big Joe stayed in his pen, his scarred snout a silent witness to the crime he'd unwittingly played a part in. Tour guides pointed him out to visitors, recounting the tale with a mix of awe and sorrow, a reminder of nature's power and human frailty. Leroy visited the preserve often, sitting by the water's edge, finding a strange peace in the ripple of the current. The tragedy had broken him, but through it, he forged something enduring, a legacy for Shanika that stretched beyond the swamp, binding a fractured town in her memory.